Questions from each group, just so you know.
Paul Graziano already noted it, but I did want to state for the record that he is a former board member and was our president from 2007 to 2009, but he's no longer on our board. Our question is very similar, and I'm glad to hear everyone already talk about corporate development and what a problem that is here. But HTC's first question would be, what do you feel is the most pressing historic preservation issue in this district?
I'm willing to say that the most prominent issue would be keeping our cultural and historical sites alive and well. As you know, we have Valley Pond Environmental, we have right here Bayside Historical, we have Flushing Town Hall, and several others. Funding for these centers, buildings, historical sites is slowly but surely all but disappearing. So I would say that keeping them alive, maintaining, renovating, how do we do that with a budget that doesn't seem to be there? As a city council person, I would always fund these cultural institutions, historical districts, historical places to the max. And as a problem solver, knowing that that's not going to be enough to cover it, I would initiate public-private partnerships, and I would continue with participatory budgeting so that places that are so special to the district and special to us will be here for generations to come.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with what Christy said about the various cultural institutions. I think that we actually have a budget process now that's skewed against nonprofits and cultural institutions, and it makes it extraordinarily hard on a year-to-year basis when the budget dance is done on the back of social service, nonprofit, and cultural institutions, social service and nonprofit providers as well as cultural institutions. You look at an institute like the Pappenhusen Institute, which is almost being bled to death, hemorrhaging funding, and you have a situation with the participatory budget where on a year-in and year-out basis, there's no guarantee that these institutions, that these historically landmark institutions are going to have the funds to continue to survive and to continue to provide the kind of services that everyone in this neighborhood has rightfully earned and grown accustomed to. So one of the things that I would like to see is an equalization of all capital and expense funding throughout the entire city. That means every councilmanic district gets an equal amount of money. We strengthen the participatory budget process by requiring it to be at least 50% of an individual council member's allocations, and we make sure that once a project wins through the participatory budget, gets the highest score, as long as it passes its agency review, then it actually gets the money so it's not put in jeopardy. If we have greater funding, we're going to have a greater ability to make sure that these historic institutions are well preserved, well maintained, well attended.
I certainly agree with both Austin and Chrissy that we have to do something to try to maintain a reliable funding stream for cultural institutions like Pappenhusen, with the understanding, of course, that that's competing against all sorts of other things. Many of the candidates here will talk about increasing teachers' salaries as well, which I also certainly support in an ideal world, but I recognize choices have to be made. Our mayor is going to face those choices, the council is going to face those choices, but certainly I would feel very strongly that a high priority in those budget trade-offs has got to be maintaining reliable funding that doesn't disappear from year to year for the precious cultural institutions like Pappenhusen. But I will say to you, and I'm not sure every candidate will, and of course life is a trade-off. That unfortunately is what government is about. As to the most important historical preservation issue, it is continuing the landmark process. I do want to say that I'm a strong supporter of that. There's an issue in my community now. I support extending landmarking to the one area in the Douglas Manor, Douglas Hill community that is not affected now. I would argue and have argued with the residents of that district, that they should vote for it, that they should support it, that it's in their interest and in the interest of the broader community. I will say, though, because it's been a little controversial, I would not support, I support educating people. I would not support imposing something against the majority view. I think that just simply is not the American way. I don't even support elevating myself to the city council if I lose the election. You know, the majority has to prevail, and you can't just go in and say to people, when you are against this, when we can't get a majority in support, that we're going to impose it on you. Education is the way.
I want to thank Dennis for actually answering the question. Historic preservation is extremely important in the 19th Council District. It's not about funding cultural institutions. Cultural institutions need to be funded, and these are wonderful historic buildings that need to be protected. Saving our neighborhoods from being destroyed is the #1 historic preservation issue in this district. 10 years ago, then Councilman, now Senator Avella, who's endorsed me in this race, had hired me as a consultant at the request of the civic associations and homeowners associations in this district to do a survey of every single property in the 19th Council District, which I did. And from that, we've rezoned every square inch of the district, created the R2A and R12A anti-McMansion zones, and I have also found at least 24 potential historic districts in this council district. I placed 1,330 buildings on the National Register with the intent of being a city landmark district. The Douglaston extension, there's no issue, frankly, Dennis. And again, I'm disagreeing with you. That was supposed to be included in the original Douglas Manor designation in 1998. There is no issue whether people are against it or in favor of it. The Ailes House in Bayside and Hawthorne Court in Bayside have both been calendared by the Commission, as has Douglaston Extension. Again, the current councilman refuses to allow these buildings to be designated. The Ailes House being the last Bell Mansion. You know, Bell Boulevard? If this is not a cultural institution by the name of it and being the last surviving house, it needs to be protected. All of these neighborhoods, Beach Court, parts of Auburndale and Epcot and Bayside, there are at least 5 districts in Bayside, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on, as I have in the past. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Dennis, if you lose the election but win the bike race, maybe you should assume.
We're going to start the election based on the bike race.
So, yeah, I mean, overdevelopment is definitely tied to this issue, and I also want to start by congratulating the Historic Districts Council for your successes over the years. I know they're very hard. Your hard work has really done a lot of good for our community, and I thank you for that. And Paul, I don't believe when you left in 2009, you left under a dark cloud. Am I right about that? When you left the board?
No?
I'm kidding.
The weirdest response ever now.
Anyway, little levity. Yes, preserving our neighborhoods is the most important aspect of this. And as I walk around the district ringing doorbells, I see a number of areas that really deserve landmark designation. And that is something that I think the city council member in this district should make a really strong priority, because as Paul did say, that is something that is fundamentally important to the people of this district. To preserve our quality of life, it's absolutely necessary. And as I said at the outset of this, overdevelopment is very much tied into this, and so I just want to assure everybody in this audience and everybody in the 19th District that I will never accept campaign contributions from developers, because I think that is an inherent conflict of interest. If a development proposal comes along and the council member accepts campaign contributions from the developer, who's he going to listen to? Who's she going to listen to? So I think that's fundamentally important, that we have a council member who will not accept donations from developers in order to truly represent the interests of this community, not the developers.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go back to Yating and the New York League of Conservation Voters.
Great, thank you. So our second question has to do with resiliency in the face of climate change impacts. And I think Mr. Chaffron, earlier you touched on that a little bit. Earlier this summer, Mayor Bloomberg announced a very comprehensive plan that contains hundreds of actionable recommendations, both for the rebuilding of communities impacted by Sandy and also increasing the resiliency of our infrastructure and buildings citywide. So as council member, what types of policies and investments would you support and push for to make sure that this community is prepared for the next storm or whatever climate change sort of impacts throws at us?
Well, let's just say Austin.
No, we'll start again.
Okay. First of all, I think the Bloomberg administration did an admirable job in developing that plan. I think the city really has to focus on enforcing it and funding it. Having been victimized, I mean, my area of Little Neck has lost a lot of trees, and we lost power several times over the past few years. And I think that even though it's an expensive proposition, one thing I think we have to prioritize, at least in this area, is the placing of electric lines underground. I know that's a big investment, but if we don't start to do that now, it's not going to get any cheaper down the road, and I think it's something that we really have to begin that process, because once I think the process begins, it's not going to stop, and we're going to have to keep funding it, and I think that funding should be baseline so that that's a project that gets done. There are lots of other things that I think the City Council member's office can do to help in situations like this. We can identify those citizens who are vulnerable and reach out to them to make sure they are safe when extreme weather comes. There are people who are unable to get around, they're disabled in certain ways. A registry has to be made of them, and in this district I will make that registry in my council office to make sure those people can be brought safely can be brought out of harm's way. And those are the kinds of things that I think the City Council member's office has to focus on, because I think that when it comes to saving lives, we have to really act locally. That can't be a city policy that comes on down from on top. It's got to be the City Council member's office doing it locally to make sure we can help our citizens survive. So yes, in addition to making sure that we implement the Bloomberg Commission recommendations and putting the power lines underground, I think it's also important on a local level for the City Council member to make sure that the citizens of the 19th District are kept safe when that kind of weather comes.
Well, while I certainly agree about putting lines underground, there are a couple of fairly easy solutions. Some of the choices we're going to have to make with sea level rise and other climate issues are difficult issues, but some of the easier issues are to do and expand some of the things that have been going on. For example, how about trimming our street trees? We are supposed to have our street trees. We have 100-year-old trees in many of our neighborhoods. They're supposed to be trimmed every 2 or 3 years. They're trimmed every 15 years. A lot of what happened with Superstorm Sandy had to do with the fact that while some of it was unavoidable, there's no question, some of it was, without a question, quite avoidable. So there's common sense stuff like that that needs to be taken care of. Not paving over our green space so that our grounds can absorb water. We created the Yards Text Amendment, this was about 5 years ago, to stop people from paving over their entire front yard. Okay, that was a very important move, and it's been very helpful in stopping, not creating impervious surfaces. In terms of the waterfront itself, I've been working with a guy named James Servino, who's one of the best marine biologists in the country, if not in the world, to help reseed oyster beds along the shorefront to create essential artificial oyster reefs, or not artificial, but regrowing the oyster reefs that used to protect our coastline. These are the kinds of things that will help when a storm surge comes, break that wave before it hits the shoreline. I mean, again, these are actually fairly common sense, easy things to do, and they don't cost a lot of money. And I've looked at the Bloomberg implementations, and some of them are quite good, but many of them are not. For example, pushing for a new development on the East River next to South Street Seaport on an artificial levee. We need to be dealing with what's coming in front of us. And again, the best way to deal with that is to deal with all the little things that are happening now, as well as planning for the future. So,
from what I've seen of the Bloomberg proposal, I would certainly be very inclined to support it. I think it addresses what has to be addressed. Obviously, it's a long proposal, and we've got to listen to what the experts say about any specific project, but I think we're moving in the right direction. In terms of this district, which the question was about, our biggest problem here, we were less impacted by Sandy, obviously much less than the South Shore, but we were less impacted by Sandy than we have been by some terrible storms that have come through in a few years before. We've had one or two very bad microbursts, one of which took down, it seemed like about a quarter of the trees in parts of Douglaston. We had the tornado that was over in the Flushing and Bayside part of the district. And what's scarier is that regular thunderstorms that don't classify as microbursts, that don't spawn tornadoes, every one of them takes down a few of these old trees that Paul mentioned, and we're at a point where we've got to do something about that. Now, we see this horrible tragedy that just happened just outside the district in Casino Park a few weeks ago. The pregnant woman who was killed by a falling tree. She sat on a bench, and there have been other incidents like this throughout the city. But in particular, we have a lot of old trees here. To the extent that they can be pruned and saved, great. But I like to be, in the last debate and this one, I've spoken about trade-offs. It's funny, environmentalists really don't like to talk about tearing down trees. Some of them will probably have to go, though, because human life is more precious. Now, obviously, I'm all for replacing any of those trees that were taken down. We had a great guy in the Douglaston area, Dr. Kellerman, who planted many trees over the years. But again, life is a trade-off, and we've probably got to look very seriously at this issue of our beautiful trees that are potentially lethal.
I'm actually going to go back to one of the answers I started to give before, because I do think that it's one of the most important things when approaching either preparation for one of these historic storms like Sandy, or just as Dennis said, the regular storms, the high wind velocity days that we've seen with greater frequency, and that's making sure that as a city capital expenditure, we're getting power lines where necessary placed underground, and it should be done in a manner in which it's not passed on to ratepayers. I do think between a citywide capital expenditure and mandating that Con Ed works with the city to come up with a plan to better prepare these areas, that we can get it done. Yes, there will be a cost, but yes, it will end up saving us money in the long run, and it's going to make it a lot safer for everyone, especially seniors who, if they have downed power lines, if they're not able to be particularly mobile, are going to be in an extraordinarily dangerous situation. We also should have the establishment of a homeowner's hotline to take care of, as Paul mentioned, the regular tree pruning, and to make sure that Con Ed is not doing it in any which way they want, because if it's not pruned regularly, or if it's done in the wrong manner, that can be just as dangerous. Now, one of the last things that I wanted to mention affects this neighborhood and probably all neighborhoods, and we saw it during Hurricane Sandy. I was a member of Governor Cuomo's administration. I traveled around the city from shore to from all across the North Shore and the South Shore, seeing the differences, and the one commonality was gas. Everyone in this neighborhood felt the effects of the gas shortage, and it wasn't because of a lack of gas, it was because of distribution problems. I think that there should be mandated generators, backup generators for every gas station to make sure that we don't have 2, 3, 4-hour lines at the pump. That is something that should be part of our storm planning, because if you can't travel around, you're going to be in a lot more trouble than anyone would ever like to imagine.
So I worked in the New York City Council office during the tornado and Hurricane Sandy, and they were just two terrible natural disasters that we were faced with. We actually kept the council office open 24 and 48 hours straight to meet the needs and help the people of the 19th Council District wherever we could. And I would tell you that the biggest issues that we faced Con Ed, no power, fire as a result, and the downed trees, they were everywhere. In fact, in the tornado, when I came back home from Astoria, I could not even believe what my neighborhood had looked like. That really led to loss of life. People could not get to the hospitals. There was a lot of emergency care. So I do agree with the other candidates here. Underground wires for Con Ed, I think that if we had started that 10 or 15 years ago, it would have paid for itself maybe 2 times over already. And as far as the trees that we have, I'm not going to go as far as to say that the mayor should not plant new trees, because I think we need to have trees for our future generations. But the trees here in District 19 are in need of pruning. But ladies and gentlemen, it's the budget of District 19 that we get to choose and allot money to the Parks Department for. So I believe in working with the community groups, with the civic leaders, sitting down and not proposing a 1-year budget, but a 4-year plan for how we're going to allot money to different agencies to make the improvements that we need in District 19, and to put a plan together and for all of us to figure out what the priorities should be. It's a plan, it's priorities, and it's not 1 year, it's over 4. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to go back to Nadezhda and